This is the Who is Guilty podcast. To begin with, in Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the story begins with the first chapter, the story of the door, which is the introduction of Mr. Utterson and how Enfield and Mr. Utterson go on for a walk and encounter a door, which leads to Mr. Enfield telling Mr. Utterson of an experience with a door, and they both agree not to talk about it again. To continue the story, it leads on to Chapter 2, Search for Mr. Hyde. In this chapter, Mr. Utterson reads Dr. Jekyll's will. Then Mr. Utterson visits Dr. Lanyon, and during the visit, Dr. Lanyon expresses his dislikes for Dr. Jekyll and his beliefs. Mr. Utterson thus looks for Mr. Hyde, eventually finding Hyde, and learns a little bit about him, such as what he looks like, and it's revealed that they're somehow tied together. After those events, it leads on to Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease, in which this chapter portrays Dr. Jekyll throwing a dinner party, and during these events, Mr. Utterson stays back so the two gentlemen can speak privately and ask about Mr. Hyde and the strange will. This then causes Dr. Jekyll to beg Mr. Utterson to let the issue drop, saying that he's taken an interest in Mr. Hyde. By in Chapter 4, the Carew murder case, where everyone in London is shocked by a terrible crime which was witnessed by a maid who saw everything. She saw the two men talking, one of whom is Mr. Hyde. Suddenly, Mr. Hyde beats the old gentleman to death, causing the maid to faint. Later, we find out that the old man had a letter on him addressed to Mr. Utterson. He recognizes the body as Sir Danvers Carew, and the broken walking stick as a gift he had been given to by Dr. Jekyll some years before. Mr. Utterson and the police officer later visit Dr. Jekyll's house, but are unable to find Mr. Hyde. Events of Chapter 4 leads on to Chapter 5, Incident of the Letter. Within this chapter, Mr. Utterson goes to visit Dr. Jekyll, who looks extremely sick. Mr. Utterson asks Dr. Jekyll about Mr. Hyde, and Dr. Jekyll swears that he will never see or contact Mr. Hyde again. Dr. Jekyll gives Mr. Utterson a letter written by Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson then is curious and shares it with his head clerk, Mr. Guest, who just happens to be a handwriting expert and states Dr. Jekyll wrote the letter. Later on in Chapter 6, remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. Despite a massive manhunt for Mr. Hyde, he is still nowhere to be found. Dr. Jekyll becomes well and happy, throwing dinner parties and engaging in charitable works, and getting closer to religion. Along with that, Mr. Utterson and Dr. Lanyon dine with him on the 8th of the month, and all is well. But on the 12th, 14th, and 15th, they are denied admittance. Carrying on, Mr. Utterson visits Dr. Lanyon, who looks near death. Dr. Lanyon claims that his friendship with Dr. Jekyll is over. Mr. Utterson thus writes Dr. Jekyll and gets a response saying that nothing can be done nor fixed. And a week later, Lanyon dies. But before the death, Dr. Lanyon left Mr. Utterson with an envelope that requests that it not be opened until the death or disappearance of Dr. Jekyll. Following this, Mr. Utterson constantly tries to visit Dr. Jekyll, but is repeatedly turned away. And then on to Chapter 7, Incident at the Window. Mr. Utterson goes on his weekly walk with Mr. Enfield, passing by the door from the beginning. It turns out that the door from the beginning is the back way to Dr. Jekyll's house and laboratory. They then step into the courtyard with all the windows and spot Dr. Jekyll at one of the windows. Dr. Jekyll thus looks sick and pale, and then they chat briefly before something strange happens to Dr. Jekyll, who slams the window shut. But what the two men saw scared them for life. Following that, in Chapter 8, The Last Night, Poole shows up at Mr. Utterson's door convinced that something terrible has happened to his master. They arrive at Dr. Jekyll's, where all the servants are scared and frightened. Poole announces Mr. Utterson's presence to Dr. Jekyll, but refuses to see his old friend. Mr. Utterson hears the voice and links it to Mr. Hyde's. Poole informs Mr. Utterson about Dr. Jekyll, or whoever's in that room/laboratory, has been asking for a chemical via slip of paper. Although it hasn't been able to be obtained, whatever that is that he's looking for. Later on, using an axe and a kitchen poker, Poole and Mr. Utterson break into the room, thus finding a body of a man who has committed suicide, twitching on the floor. Proceeding on with the book, in Chapter 9, Dr. Lignon's narrative. Dr. Lignon writes to tell Utterson the events that led to his death. Dr. Lignon received a correspondence from Dr. Jekyll requesting that he assist him in getting a medicine from a cabinet. He then would send a messenger to receive it from him and requested that he ask no questions when the messenger arrived. Dr. Lignon completed the request, and when the messenger arrived, he was to take the medicine and leave, but Dr. Lignon was too curious and asked him to fill out whatever was going on and what he was going to do. The messenger drank the liquid, and after much pain and changing, evolved into Henry Jekyll right before of Dr. Lignon's eyes. The messenger that first entered confessed Dr. Jekyll was none other than the dreadful Edward Hyde, the murderer of Carew. Continuing on to Chapter 10, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Henry Jekyll explains the reasons for what he has done, and from the beginning he had felt that there were two men conflicting inside of him, and he had the desire to separate them from one another. He experimented, thus coming to a conclusion that he has created a man who we know as Edward Hyde. To add on, Jekyll wanted to keep it a secret that he was the man behind this, so he created a will giving all material money to Hyde, as if the experiment were to completely fail and he would remain Hyde forever. He also found a way to turn himself back into regular old Jekyll, as he was venturing out as Hyde became a way that he could escape and do things recklessly. Jekyll's life was the good old life, while Hyde was the young, reckless side of him. Jekyll thought that he had it all under control until the murder of Carew, and after, when Hyde would come back out with a mixture, he needed more and more to remain more of himself, and in the end he died from overdosing on the medicine that was meant as an escape. In the end, there is still one important question: who is guilty for killing Carew? Is it Jekyll or is it Hyde? Jekyll and Hyde are the same person, yes, but Hyde is the one seen at the scene of the crime, and Jekyll is the one not able to control himself as Hyde. Personally, it would be Jekyll's fault due to starting the mutation or transformation as Hyde in the first place. Not only is he warned not to do this by the other doctor, but he's also continuing the experiment. Not only that, but he has no control over himself and ended up killing Carew. In the end, if Jekyll never did the danger experiment, Carew